Okay, the poll. I'm going to end the poll. And let's see what we found out. Okay, most of the people here are asset managers for an owner, but we have a large group of people who work for syndicators, investors, or lenders. And we have some people who are not asset management, a good chunk of them. And you guys can just kind of scroll down. We have mostly nonprofit owners and people who work for lenders, and this is their organization, mostly owners, and then lenders, and then intermediaries. And as usual, we have a wide variety of organizations with different asset management sizes. So the larger ones are probably our lenders and our syndicators and some very big developers, but about half the people here have units under $5,000 units. So that's a pretty big range of people who are here today. So thanks for coming. So my name is Julia Pearson, and I'm the Executive Director of CHAM. And I'm just going to give you a couple logistics, and I'm going to turn it over to the team. So first of all, we're going to use Q&A. Q&A, please use that for questions that you want or anything you want the presenters to know. If you have an idea or something you want to communicate to everyone, go ahead and put it in chat. And the presenters will be looking at the Q&A and maybe answering the questions live, in writing. They might save it to the end. So, keep an eye on the Q&A if you asked a question, and feel free, you probably can answer too if you know something. We're going to do a feedback survey at the end. So whenever you log off, it's going to pop up. Please take a minute to fill it out. Now, I thought the slides were available now, and the recording and the handouts. There's a link that Emma's putting in the chat that will that you should be able to go to the page where the links are. If it's not working, I'll have to fix it later, and we'll send you an email later with it. Emma, in the meantime, if it's not working, Emma, by the way, Emma is our intern from Virginia Tech. She's behind the scenes today. Emma, then you can put the materials in the chat later on when you get a chance.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thank you. Veruda also telling me chat is disabled for participant input. Maybe it's just going to the presenters. I don't know. Sometimes webinars, the Zoom webinar is a mystery because sometimes it's one way and sometimes it's the other. I apologize for it not quite working the way I expected. We are recording today, and the recording will be available on probably on Monday, and we'll send you the link to that. So those are the logistics. We got it all set. So now we're going to start. I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today, the Washington Report for CHAM. And I'm really excited that the speakers that are here, they have a couple of them just were at a Senate hearing. They're going to talk about what's going on, the latest in affordable housing. And I'm going to turn this over to Peter Lawrence from Novogradac, who will introduce the panelists and be our moderator today. Peter, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you to all of you for joining CHAM's 2020-22 Public Policy Webinar. As Julia said, I'm Peter Lawrence, Director of Public Policy and Government Relations at Novogradac. And I've always greatly appreciated the opportunity to speak to the CHAM audience about the key federal housing policy developments. I am really excited and honored to moderate this fantastic panel of administration and affordable housing leaders. We have, in alphabetical order, Ethan Handelman, Deputy Assistant Secretary from Office of Multifamily Housing at HUD. Thank you, Ethan. We have Ellen Lurie Hoffman, the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Community and Economic Development at Treasury. Thank you, Ellen. And last and certainly not least, one of the busiest people today, Jennifer Schwartz, Director of Tax and Housing Advocacies at the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Thank you all for joining us. We are really delighted that you were able to fit some time in your busy schedule to come inform CHAM attendees at this critical time for housing policy in this webinar. So this webinar is roughly divided into 3 sections. We have a legislative outlook for housing. We have the key regulatory developments for housing, new directions at HUD. And we are going to, at the very end, briefly talk about advocacy actions and then reserve the roughly 10 to 15 minutes for open Q&A. I'll just note, as Julia said, if there are questions that help move the conversation forward, I may attempt to try to weave them into the conversation, but in general, I am going to look towards reserving them to the end of the session. So please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A pane. So with that housekeeping and introductions out of the way, let's get started. And before we go talk about the legislative outlook, I wanted to give an opportunity to Ellen to discuss your new position and office at Treasury. I mean, many of you may have seen Ellen in previous CHAM conferences and webinars when she worked at the National Housing Trust and was also at National Council of State Housing Agencies, but are maybe not as familiar about your new office. And so, Ellen, could you provide a brief overview?
Thanks, Peter, and thank you to CHAM. I'm really happy to be with you all today, and as Peter said, for the first time in my new role. So I am in the Office of Community and Economic Development at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and I'm guessing that a lot of people might not be that familiar with our office. We had a different name in the previous administration, but our office is all about focusing on coordinating and advancing community development efforts across the Treasury Department and the federal government in pursuit of a stronger and more equitable economy. And our agenda is based on the basic idea that the U.S. economy as a whole will be stronger in terms of both stability and growth if people and communities have an equitable opportunity to more fully achieve their economic potential. And a big part of that work for us, and it's a policy office, is to reduce the racial, ethnic, and geographic wealth gaps that exist in our economy, and that in order to do that, there needs to be a number of interrelated efforts to help people prepare to function effectively in the economy. So OSED, as we call it, our work is focused on increasing equitable neighborhood development and regional economic development. And this includes creating access to housing, both rental housing and the equity associated with homeownership. In terms of programs at Treasury that we look at, obviously that includes the low-income housing tax credit, which I know all of my fellow panelists are very experienced and well-versed in, as well as the Community Development Financial Institution CDFI Fund. We're going to talk today about the opportunity to use the state and local fiscal recovery funds from the American Rescue Plan for housing. We also are going to talk about emergency rental assistance. All these resources are coming out of Treasury, as well as the Housing Assistance Fund and the Emergency Capital Investment Program. So those are some of the programs that my office looks at, and happy to be with you all in a slightly different role. I won't be talking about legislation, but I can talk some more about what we are working on when the time is right. So thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Ellen. Let's now turn to the legislative outlook. Arguably the most significant piece of legislation we've been following since last year has been the reconciliation bill, formerly known as the Build Back Better Act, or as some have called it, the Waiting for Joe Manchin Act. So the House passed, and December 2021 Senate draft contained $12 billion in low-income housing tax credit and housing bond proposals, a $6 billion down payment on the creation of the neighborhood homes tax credit and more than $150 billion in one-time housing and community development and related spending proposals, much of which would be administered by HUD and Treasury. So, however, of course, things have clearly changed since December. In fact, they've even changed since we scheduled this webinar and I initially drafted my questions. Jennifer, could you update attendees on where we are in the process? You know, will a reconciliation bill pass this Congress? Well, what proposals involving housing are likely to be included at all, and what can we hope for?
Well, I wish I had a more optimistic outlook on this. But before I dive into where we are, just a little bit of background for those of you who are outside of the Beltway and don't toss around words like reconciliation. The thing you really have to understand about a reconciliation bill and what makes it special is that it has special protections from the filibuster in the Senate, which means that most legislation that passes has to first pass a procedural vote that requires 60 members to vote in favor of it. A reconciliation bill doesn't need to do that. So it can pass with a simple majority of, 50 plus one in this instance. So if everybody will remember the split between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, it is 50-50, which means that tiebreakers are done by the vice president. And that means that all 50 members of the Senate 50 Democrats in the Senate need to vote for a bill like this, because a reconciliation bill is always going to be a partisan bill. You are never going to get a member, or I think it is very unlikely, not that it would be impossible, I suppose, but very unlikely that a member from the other party is going to vote in favor of a reconciliation bill. So that's where we start with this. And it's been kind of like a slowly shrinking down of what could possibly be in this reconciliation bill, from very, very grand plans prior to the budget passing to the budget passing calling for this bill, but with less money than I think some on the very further to the left had hoped for, and slowly being shrunk down more. And as Peter had mentioned, we had pretty significant legislation that passed through the House last fall, and then similar pieces of that legislation coming out in the Senate. And then in December, Senator Manchin, who of course is that 50th vote for the Democrats, said that he could not move forward with his supporting the bill, and everything kind of came to a standstill. And then more recently, these negotiations kind of picked back up again. And what we were expecting was a much slimmer version of the reconciliation bill, but something that still had a tax title dealing with things like climate, because a lot of that is dealt with through the tax code. And potentially the possibility of moving some of our housing tax legislation. We knew from a while ago that housing spending was much less likely to be included in the final bill. But just last week, given the concerns about inflation, Senator Manchin had said that he's not ready to act on even that much more slimmed down version, and wanted to put a hold on parts of it, at least. And the parts where he does seem to have agreement with Senator Schumer and the White House are mostly on the healthcare side. And so what we don't know is whether or not the Senate is going to pass basically a proposal that's really focused on healthcare, that does not have tax priorities in it, that would not have our housing credit or neighborhood homes or any of the other housing bills, housing pieces of that, if they're going to pass that now before the August recess, or would they come back afterwards when there's more data about the trending of inflation and make a decision at that point. Either way, I think that the reconciliation train is going to be a very difficult one to jump onto. And I think we all had very high hopes, but I don't want to give you false hopes either.
And the deadline for September 30th, right, Jennifer? So
Correct.
it's the end game here. We'll, beyond that, there it doesn't seem likely that we'll have yet another reconciliation bill. It's theoretically possible, but it doesn't seem very likely to happen.
Reconciliation bills take a lot of floor time. There's what's called a vote-a-rama. Very unlikely that something's going to happen, later on. So I think the White House is kind of ready to accept the healthcare provisions. And, some of those are really important for the Affordable Care Act. So you can understand why they want to do that. But that does mean that we will be trying to look at other opportunities to move our priorities.
Well, you're a great segue to my next question. So assuming that either whether the reconciliation bill passes or not, doesn't seem likely to have housing proposals. What are the other opportunities for advancing housing tax legislation this year? Could you walk us through the other potential vehicles and timeline for consideration?
So, I think that if any legislation that moves that could have a tax title is something we want to take seriously. But I think the one that is most likely is going to be an end of year package. And this is pretty common that Congress puts together a package at the end of the year that cleans up a bunch of things, especially at the end of a Congress. So this would be a package that would happen in the lame duck session after the election. Oftentimes, the new Congress wants to start fresh. They don't want to be dealing with appropriations. They don't want to be dealing with, tax extenders that have not been finalized by the previous Congress. And so there's usually a lot of impetus at the end of the year to pass a package. I think we all expect that appropriations is not going to be finished by September 30th. That's going to have a continuing resolution and could be something that they would have to deal with in a lame duck session. And I think that that's a really good opportunity for us for tax provisions. It would be something that would have to pass on a bipartisan basis. So it's not going to be as grand as what we were initially hoping for in the Build Back Better legislation last year. But I think that especially because so many of our affordable housing priorities do have bipartisan support, and I think that especially with rent increases being as high as they are, this problem is becoming realer and realer to more members of Congress from across the spectrum. And we might have a chance to move, tax extenders, certainly, and which we have one of with the housing credit cap, that the increase that expired at the end of 2021. But I think that we're also very hopeful that we'll get more than that there will be interest in doing a tax package that would be part of a larger bill. And that tax package would not just be limited to, extending expiring or expired tax provisions, but really could be a broader tax package that brought to bear a number of different affordable housing provisions that have bipartisan support.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And, one example of that recently, the 4% floor was enacted in a lame duck session. And so it certainly is possible, right, to have a productive lame duck session. The new markets, looking back a little bit further, the new markets tax credit was actually created also in a lame duck session, legislation passed then. So it's always uncertain, but it's certainly a possibility. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye out that. So the last sort of legislation question along these lines, Jennifer, I wanted to ask you about, and was actually featured in today's Senate Finance Committee hearing, is the Lifeline Act. And we'll talk about the American Rescue Plan's coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, or as I'm going to refer to going forward, recovery funds, more simply. And we'll talk about how using that in the housing during our regulatory development section. But the Lifeline Act is a key legislative issue. We want to give you an opportunity to talk about it, describe what it is and what are its prospects for passing and timing.
Yeah, so thank you. This is a big priority for the state housing finance agencies. As will be no surprise to anybody watching this webinar, development costs have spiraled significantly over the last couple of years, and the volatility continues. What we are seeing at the state level is developers coming to the state housing finance agencies with massive financing gaps that were totally unexpected, not due to the fault of the developer. This is really about escalating commodity costs and supply chain disruptions that are leading to delays that are further adding to those costs. And one of the resources, a really significant resource that we might be able to use to help fill those gaps is the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which we're going to talk about a little bit more about all the logistics of that. But the idea is that we want to be able to use those funds to provide long-term loans to housing credit development so that those loans can be used as that gap filler. The state and local fiscal recovery funds are funded out of the American Rescue Plan Act, which was passed the March before last, March of 2021. So it's a big pot of money, but what we know is that there's a fair amount of it that's going towards affordable housing, and specifically for this purpose. The challenge here is that those funds, the way that they're intended to work, in most cases is best as a grant, and we can't really use grants effectively with the housing credit because it reduces the amount of basis that is eligible for credits, and it also is a taxable event to a for-profit developer, and brings along with it some other challenges as well. So what we'd like to do is be able to use it as a loan. And under the American Rescue Plan statute, and Treasury's interpretation of that statute, there are some major barriers to doing a long-term loan that has a maturity after 2026. Congress had initially intended for these funds to be used quickly because these are emergency funds. And so this whole concept of using it as a loan with a maturity that is longer is not something that I think was initially considered as part of the statute. And so there are, while there is a way to do it, it is not an efficient way at all, and extremely difficult and requires other resources to blend in with fiscal recovery funds. So very, very complicated. The easiest thing to do would be to amend the statute so that you could do just a simple long-term loan just with those fiscal recovery fund dollars, and put that into the capital stack with the housing credit. And that's exactly what the Lifeline Act does. It is a bicameral piece of legislation, so it's in both chambers, and it is bipartisan in both chambers with the sponsorship of Senator Leahy and Senator Collins in the Senate, and Representative Adams and Representative Rouser in the House. So we are definitely pushing for support and hoping that we are going to be able to advance that bill this year so that we can make efficient use of the billions of dollars that this could potentially unlock.
And because it's not tax legislation, we don't have to wait for a tax bill to advance it. Are there any particular bills you think on the horizon that might be good vehicles to carry it, or what were your thoughts and what the timing on that?
A lot of this is going to depend on what Congress is able to move forward with. There have been, as you were just saying, this can move on any bill because this is a change to the fiscal recovery fund, not a change to Section 42. I don't want to go into the specifics because I know there's a lot of discussion behind the scenes about what might make the most sense, but needless to say, we will be looking for every opportunity to advance this legislation. I hope we don't have to wait until the end of the year.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so now we've talked about the main legislative issues in Congress. I do want to turn, Ethan's been very patient sitting there. We did not invite him to be a potted plant. We greatly looking forward to his expertise, and I do want to say that one significant development in housing policy has been the administration's release of the Housing Supply Action Plan, which has actually legislative and regulatory components and is designed to try to help close the gap in supply that we have, putting the power of the federal government towards this issue. So we're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory components later, but we want to first focus on legislative aspects of this. And so, Ethan, let's start with the HUD components. One of the major proposals in the Housing Action Plan, and certainly look forward to your thoughts more generally on it, but it was also included in the HUD's fiscal year 2023 budget request, is the Housing Supply Fund, which is a proposed $35 billion mandatory spending, not part of the usual discretionary budget appropriations process, would be administered by HUD. And could you walk us through this proposal and any other HUD legislative components you'd like to highlight?
Sure, and thanks, Peter, for having me on the panel. Thanks to CHAM for having me here. It is frankly a real treat to talk to a room of asset managers and folks interested in asset management, because asset management is really important. I think of it as the beating heart of affordable housing. It's what keeps everything going, even when no one else is paying attention. It's really important stuff. So very glad to be talking with you all today. In terms of the Housing Supply Action Plan, that is here because Secretary Fudge and the Biden-Harris administration recognize the uphill battle that families are facing when it comes to the shortage of affordable housing. That's why HUD is using every tool available to try and boost affordable housing supply. To address that critical shortage of quality affordable housing in communities across the country, including often underserved, predominantly Black and Latino communities, the president's budget proposed $50 billion in a combination of mandatory funding, which you highlighted in the supply fund, and additional low-income housing tax credits and some other funds to address those market gaps and increase supply. So the Housing Supply Fund would be $35 billion, and it's on the mandatory side. And you're right to highlight that. I used to be on the advocacy side, and it's exciting to see housing over on the mandatory side. This would be providing grants to state and local housing finance agencies and their partners to invest in strategies to increase supply. Rough estimate is that these funds would support development of about 500,000 new homes that would help to stabilize housing prices over the long term. They'd be further amplified by grants to remove barriers to affordable housing, things like streamlining permitting and environmental mitigation, finding ways to fund housing-related resilient infrastructure that's necessary to support the additional supply and development. There are a lot of pieces to it. I will say there are a lot of other pieces to the Housing Supply Action Plan that are legislative. They, in many ways, highlight points that Jennifer was talking about in terms of the sort of the original structure of the House passed reconciliation bill. So whether it's new project-based rental assistance, funds to increase resiliency and more environmentally focused design components to the built environment, new vouchers, new housing for the elderly, new housing for people with disabilities, you name it. There were a lot of different pieces. Among the pieces most exciting to me were the pieces focused on distressed multifamily properties, because we know there's a lot of investment needed in preservation there. But I think you and Jennifer did a great discussion already of those components.
Thank you, Ethan. Jennifer, maybe you could expand. Ethan did mention that there was a local housing tax credit proposal in the Housing Action Plan, and it was also included in the Treasury's Green Book of Tax Proposals. So it is part of the fiscal 2023 budget. That proposal would provide a 30% basis boost for private activity bond financed housing credit properties if needed for financial feasibility. And as long as they finance new construction or rehabilitation of existing housing, that results in a net increase of affordable rental homes. One example of that being like a Faircloth to RAD conversion, which I'm sure Ethan will talk more about later. It's also similar to a provision in the longstanding housing credit legislation, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. And certainly, if you could discuss, appreciate, Jennifer, from your perspective, discussing that proposal and how you see the housing credit fitting in the administration's housing policy priorities.
you'd think that I haven't been doing Zoom meetings for years now. First of all, I want to say what a big deal it is that the administration put out this affordable housing supply plan for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it really is putting the administration on record and showing that affordable housing and affordable housing supply is a priority for the administration. The focus on supply is really important because it indicates that the administration understands that the fundamental problem that we're facing in the affordable housing world is because we have this mismatch of supply and demand, and that we've been underproducing for so long. And that's across the board, not just affordable, but certainly in the affordable space, we're not producing anywhere near enough. The other thing that's really important about this is that the administration is again highlighting the congressional things that need to be done, the statutory things, but also looking at what it can do unilaterally. And so there's a number of things that are in the supply plan that are within the administration's purview. And I just want to applaud the administration for really looking at what do they have control over, what can they do now, not just what are they calling on Congress to do. That being said, getting to the actual proposal that's there, what the administration is proposing, it's in the housing supply plan, it's in the administration's budget, is a state-determined basis boost for 4% and tax-exempt bond financed properties. And we already have this over on the 9% side. That was part of HERA back in 2008. But this would allow state agencies to provide additional credits, additional 4% credits to projects that get bonds, so a basis boost there, and not just for those properties that are in DDAs or QCTs. The thing is with this is that it would only be for new construction or for rehab where there are going to be new units coming on board. And again, that is going back to the real focus on supply. And today at the Senate Finance Committee hearing, if anybody watched it, you heard Senator Cantwell at the end, saying it's supply, stupid, kind of like it's the economy, stupid. She gets it, the administration gets it, we need more supply. And getting this done with the 4%. We know the 4% and the bond programs, those are the workhouse programs. The more we can do with that, the better we are.
Great, Jennifer. One housing supply plan also discussed statutory and regulatory changes to the home program. Could you provide a brief overview of these changes, particularly those relevant for multifamily housing?
Yeah, so this on the statutory side, there is a quick reference to the administration's interest in seeing the home program reauthorized. That's something that NCSHA and other members of the Home Coalition are working on, and we're talking to folks in the administration, and Senator Cortez Masto is in process with putting together a bill. So that's very exciting for us because the home program is the flagship affordable housing supply program over at HUD. That is how you build more affordable housing. It is a key subsidy that goes into housing credit properties as well. So we're really excited about that. The other piece of that, though, of course, is regulatory reforms to the home program. And I think there are a lot of folks out there who are running properties that have home funding in it. And you probably understand better than anybody else that there are some challenges there. And right now, the administration, the HUD specifically, is looking at what are things that it can do, again, unilaterally, either through regulation, but not even just regulation, also sub-regulatory guidance and things that might be able to move faster than an actual rule that would modify the home program. So NCSHA is in the process of leading a coalition of groups on a set of proposals that we're going to be giving to HUD. And I know HUD is open to and interested in other outside stakeholders in what could be improved in the home program specifically.
Okay, great. And we have some more resources on going over the housing supply action plans when folks are interested. But given that we still have a lot to cover, not much time, I'm going to move on to the fiscal 2023 HUD budget request, which we've teased a little bit of pieces of it, but let's turn to the bread and butter. Ethan, could you provide an overview and highlights of the discretionary side here, the $71.9 billion HUD request, and how it compares with 2022, and any themes you'd like to emphasize?
Certainly, Peter, and thanks for touching on it. And I'll also tell you all, I have learned, having been on both sides of this conversation, that the last thing I want to do is read a bunch of numbers to you. So if you want a bunch of numbers, I highly encourage you to go to hud.gov/budget. You can read all the numbers you like. I'll hit just a few, but keep it high level, because the themes, I think, are what are really important here. Particularly when I come at it from the multifamily side, that's what I oversee. Our work is central to the Biden-Harris administration's focus on addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, working with the economic recovery to support it, dealing with the cost pressures of inflation that everyone is dealing with, working to support racial equity, working to address climate change. And those are the themes you also see in the budget. So just highlights. Within the budget proposal is a new initiative for multifamily housing green and resilient retrofit program to help create more, as it says, resiliency, housing that is more energy efficient, that is safer, healthier for residents, costs less to own and operate. Could be a real win across the board. It also includes $275 million for budget-based rent adjustments at selected project-based rental assistance properties. One of the questions in the Q&A already touched on this a little bit, looking for ways to help prevent the need for expensive rehab. Having healthy rents is a great way to do that, especially for properties that have been on just annual OCAF adjustments for decades. Other pieces that I think are worth highlighting, certainly there are some targeted rental assistance increases for RAD conversion subsidies. Some of those would be to enable slightly higher rents closer to actual rent levels for conversion of public housing properties over to Section 8. Similarly, some targeted subsidies for Section 202 PRAC conversions. And we can talk about that more when we talk about RAD. But overall, those are part of the full renewal of project-based Section 8 contracts, which I know, Peter, you want to talk about.
Right. So maybe anything you want to emphasize on for project-based rental assistance or 202s and 811s beyond what you already said?
Sure. And I mean, the top line is in some ways the most important. The budget asks for full renewal of those contracts, period. That's really important. We know that the projects rely on them, that the rest of the housing ecosystem relies on them. It's the federal government helping to pay the rent, and that's pretty important. So it asks for full renewal. You'll also see in the budget proposal, or may already have seen, that it includes some new funding for Section 202 and Section 811 to add to the supply of deeply assisted housing for, in the case of 202, supportive housing for the elderly, and in the case of Section 811, supportive housing for persons with disabilities. Both of those budget requests include funds for the rental assistance contracts that goes with an award, as well as the capital advance, the capital funds that help to defray some of the capital costs of creating that deeply assisted housing. There's also certainly renewal funds needed for things like the Real Estate Assessment Center, our inspections of properties. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit.
Great. And last question for you, Ethan, on the budget. I know it's not in your bailiwick, but I know the CHAM audience really does care a lot about tenant-based rental assistance or housing vouchers and public housing, given that there's a lot of intersections in that work these days. Could you just give a quick assessment of the budget request for those?
Totally. I am happy on behalf of my colleagues to color outside the lines a little bit on this one. So the president's budget includes $32.1 billion for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which includes 200,000 new vouchers to prioritize for people who are fleeing from domestic violence and households experiencing homelessness. If adopted, this would be the largest one-year increase in vouchers since the program was authorized. Those priorities are important, and overall, the use of housing choice vouchers has proven to be a really effective intervention for households as a way to create stability and create more opportunity for people. And as I'm sure many of the CHAM audience folks know, a percentage of housing choice vouchers can be project-based, to be attached to properties as part of a long-term affordability solution.
Okay, turning to Jennifer quickly, I know you talked about the housing supply action for home, but what's actually in the budget request for home? Any highlights here, Jennifer?
1.95 billion is in the administration's budget request for home. I should say that just this afternoon, the House passed the minibus that included the THUD legislation, the THUD spending bill that has less funding than what the administration had requested for home. That was just under $1.7 billion. And yes, I got a Politico alert as I was sitting here. So that is where things stand right now. And yeah, we need as much money for home as possible.
Yes, late breaking news here live
Late
on the
breaking.
webinar. Actually, well, since you started talking about this, Jennifer, can you just talk about where we are in the process more broadly and what the prospects are later on down the line?
For appropriations, sure. So as I just said, the House has done its work on appropriations. It now needs to turn to the Senate. And that's where it's going to get a little bit more difficult because there is no agreed upon between both chambers total budget amount, what we call the 302A number, nor is there agreed upon total amounts for each of the individual spending bills, what we call the 302B numbers across the chambers. So the House is working with a set of numbers that is based off of what it thinks it should be spending, and the Senate doesn't have an agreement yet. So we don't know what's going to happen over there and how individual HUD programs are going to fare. I think it's pretty likely, pretty fair to say that we will probably be seeing a continuing resolution sometime in September. The fiscal year runs out on September 30th. So in an ideal world, Congress would pass all of the appropriations bills by September 30th so that the new fiscal year starting on October 1st would have new bills with new funding levels for programs. That rarely ever happens. So I think it's very likely that we will see a continuing resolution as Congress works out, in the Senate, it works out how much it's going to spend, on individual programs, and then have to reconcile with the House. We've got a lot of work to do before next year's bills are ready, appropriations are ready.
Okay, so there's the legislative landscape. Let's switch over to the regulatory side. And I know I was afraid this was going to happen. We are a little bit behind schedule here, but I know we'll try to address the regulatory side with the attention it deserves. So Ellen, turning back to you, I know we would certainly rely on your expertise here. Let's revisit the American Rescue Plan. The recovery funds, Treasury is largely responsible for these, right? Could you provide a brief overview of how the funds can be used for housing and the guidance that Treasury has issued to date?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. So as was previously mentioned, the American Rescue Plan authorized what's called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, or SLFRF. Some people like to use the acronym SLRF. I don't necessarily recommend that, but that's what we're talking about. And this resource has delivered $350 billion, that's right, with a B, $billion to state, local, and tribal governments across the country to support their response to and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And it can be used for a wide range of need, to address a wide range of needs. Originally, the legislation was authorized to fight the pandemic and to help families and businesses that were struggling with public health and economic impacts. It can be used to maintain public services and to build a strong, resilient, and equitable recovery by making investments that will support long-term growth and opportunity. I think most of interest to this audience is definitely the way that the funds can be used to support housing. It can be used to address immediate and long-term housing challenges. It can be used to assist renters, homeowners, and unhoused individuals. And most relevant to our recent conversation, to tackle the longstanding challenge of the insufficient supply of affordable housing, which I think Jennifer did a good job of spelling out why that is such a dire need. I know there's data from NCSHA, which is really up to date and very, very helpful on what the state housing finance agencies are, how they are planning to use these funds for housing. But I'm just going to give a quick overview of what Treasury knows to be true for not just the states, but also local and tribal governments. Meeting housing needs has turned out to be one of the most common priorities for all of these governments to use these funds. And by the end of last year, nearly 570 state, local, and tribal governments had committed $11.7 billion to meet housing needs, which includes a wide range of things, again, preventing evictions and foreclosures, helping individuals experiencing homelessness, and also expanding the supply of housing to address the root causes of housing insecurity. So I won't go into, I know we're running behind, I won't go into every detail, but let's say over 700,000 households by the end of last year had received rent, mortgage, or utility assistance. Over 100,000 households have been served with eviction prevention services. Roughly $3.2 billion have been committed by state, local, and tribal governments to affordable housing development, preservation, and innovative approaches to expand the housing supply. And similarly, over $3.2 billion have been committed by 150 governments to help people experiencing homelessness find stable housing. Just want to take a minute and talk some more about how the funds are being used to increase housing supply, because it is pretty exciting. They're using it, as you won't be surprised, to build new single family and multifamily homes. They're also using it to convert existing buildings that may not even be housing currently into affordable housing. They're using it to create supportive housing options for people with special needs with wraparound services. They're using it to develop and incentivize local governments to develop vacant or government-owned land into affordable housing, and also using the funds to preserve and improve existing housing, making sure that units stay affordable, making properties energy efficient, helping landlords and homeowners with repairs. So lots of innovative uses. We're really seeing all different kinds of state and local and tribal governments step up to the plate and use their creativity and a variety of other financing sources, which they're also combining with these funds to address the specific housing needs. The Treasury Department is really encouraging the use of these funds for housing. We continue to urge state, local, and tribal governments to deepen their housing investments. As Jennifer said, we're learning more every day about more state governments and others that are making commitments to housing. And we're hoping to continue to see a dramatic increase in the use of these funds for production and preservation. For the details of the program, I would recommend that folks tuning into this webinar look at the final rule that the Treasury Department issued in January. We've also been releasing frequently asked questions over time that continuously are updated. So take a look at that. There's a link to the website in your materials for this webinar. I want to just flag one thing, which is that the guidance names the HOME program and the Housing Trust Fund program. Those are HUD programs as presumptively eligible for projects to align with. But there are many other ways that the funding can be used to provide and produce affordable housing. So definitely encourage people in state, local, and tribal governments to think creatively. I can't answer any specific questions about SLFRF or provide clarity on the final rule, but I'm again not part of the Office of Recovery, but any questions that are submitted are being carefully considered. The Office of Recovery is looking at outstanding questions which we know still exist, and they're working really hard to address them as quickly as possible so we can get these funds out the door and use them to help address the critical need for affordable housing that we know is a problem across the country.
Thank you, Ellen. And why don't we switch back to Jennifer? You have some slides to go over, so we can do this a little quickly so we can get to the rest of our questions. But go ahead, Jennifer.
I do, and I will go through this super quickly. So we've been doing, as Ellen said, some surveying of state agencies. I'm going to show you the data that we've heard back from states about how their how state level fiscal recovery funds are being used for affordable housing. This data does not include what we expect to be a really significant investment from local governments as well. So first of all, here's a map that shows, can everybody see this all right? I hope you're not seeing the top of this. Are you? Here, I'll move this over there. Sorry, hope that's better. These are the states that are have devoted fiscal recovery funds at the state level to affordable housing activities. We're still trying to get a little bit more data from a few states that have some things outstanding, but in most of these states, decisions have been made. It's possible that we'll see increased funding going to affordable housing. Certainly, in some of them, some of them had already devoted some money to affordable housing and then got more. So that was great. But this is where we stand right now. We have over 9.6 billion that state agencies, states have, excuse me, devoted to affordable housing. This is the breakdown by state that we know of right now. And this is based off of surveys of, we've heard back from 44 states, 31 of which have devoted some of this funding for affordable housing. In most cases, it is being administered by the State Housing Finance Agency, at least in part. And so in 33% of the states that are responding, it is the HFA that is running all of the funds that are for housing. In another, I guess, 20%, the state HFA is administering, it's going to be administered by another entity, but in conjunction with HFA programs. In 17% of the states, the HFA is going to be administering part of those funds and another agency is administering the rest. And 9%, it is going to be administered by another agency and not in conjunction with HFA programs. And the rest are either not applicable, to be determined, we don't know yet. And this is just another way of taking a look at that $9.6 billion in investment and which states are putting money into this. As I mentioned before, the most common use of these funds is housing credit gap financing. That is what states are saying they want to be using, but most states are saying they want to be able to use these funds with the housing credit. But there are, as Ellen was saying, just a number of different things that states are saying, yeah, our plan is to build more affordable rental housing, even if it doesn't have the housing credit, or permanent supportive housing is going to be part of this, or homeless assistance is going to be part of this, eviction prevention is going to be part of this. I'm hearing from states that want to do down payment assistance or single family construction. So there's a lot of different things that this money is intended to be used for at the state level. And then this is just the other resources that we expect to be leveraged with fiscal recovery funds. So, you know, the housing credit and a number of programs over at HUD, tax exempt bonds, state funds. So it's interesting stuff. All of this is available on NCSHA's website. So feel free to go and take a look. And we are trying to update as more information comes out, which is pretty, it's happening a lot.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I know that was really fast, but you have those slides, and I'm sure you can answer questions later down the line. Another key part of American Rescue Plan, as well as the previous COVID legislation, was the $46 billion in emergency rental assistance. I guess I'll just toss it to both Ellen and Jennifer to discuss the status of that and the future action.
Thanks, Peter. I was hoping we would have the absolute latest data on the use of emergency rental assistance, and it's almost done, but I can't talk about it yet. So I'll use the most recent data, which I think was released in June on the use of emergency rental assistance. There's two tranches. Again, the first is ERA, what we call ERA 1, which is the $25 billion in emergency rental assistance that was authorized as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. And of that funding, more than $19.5 billion has been spent on financial assistance, including rental assistance and utility assistance. The second tranche is ERA 2. That was the $21.6 billion in funds that were authorized as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. And of that funding, over $9 billion has been expended on financial assistance. Most state and local governments have either closed their programs or in the process of winding them down, having used most or all of the funds from both of the tranches. And ERA 1 is officially going to sunset at the end of September. So new data should be out again soon, as I mentioned. So keep an eye on the Treasury website, which again, there's a link to. But I think there's been, I know I've seen a lot of research in academia and housing advocacy about the enormous impact that the emergency rental assistance has made in keeping people in their homes during and I guess in the ongoing pandemic and economic impact from the public health emergency.
So just to add on to what Ellen was saying, those numbers that she was citing as to how much had been spent, that's what's been spent on financial assistance. That doesn't include the amount that's been spent on housing stability services, on much needed program administration costs. I think that there is no question that the ERA 1 money will be well out the door by September 30th, all gone. There is a little bit that's being reallocated between grantees, but overall, grantees have gone through this money. And ERA 2, which even though that technically does not need to be spent until September 30th of 2025, I'm going to put my money on it being all gone by the end of the calendar year. I don't think we will have anything left other than maybe some housing stability services programs on eviction prevention and working with the courts that will be going into next year. And to put this in context, Ethan, how big is the HUD budget?
Oh, it's not that big. Our budget request was $79 billion.
Okay, so this was $46 billion. So, it's a lot of money that has gone out essentially in a year and a half. And it helped a lot of people. It was an incredibly successful program. I think that everybody should be really proud of the amount of people that we saved during this time.
Great, thanks. And we could do a lot more time, but we are rapidly running out of time. So I'm going to move on. And we could spend an entire webinar. In fact, just before this webinar started, I recorded about an hour's worth of the Tax Credit Tuesday for next week on the Community Reinvestment Act. And this is obviously one of the most consequential community development regulatory developments this year. And it's particularly important. 85% of the housing credit investment demand comes from CRA motivated institutions. Most of the loans, I believe, we don't have a precise accounting of that, but we believe a lot of the loans to housing credit properties are also motivated by CRA. So obviously very important. Jennifer, could you provide a really probably all too brief overview of the joint notice of proposal we're making?
I think it's impossible to do this in a really brief time period. Needless to say, I think the concern, so this joint notice of proposed rulemaking is all three of the regulator entities that regulate banks coming together to consider new regulations for Community Reinvestment Act. Nothing could be more consequential to the housing credit program because this drives such a huge amount of the investments. There are a lot of concerns, I think, that are out there about what happens if the investment test goes away, which is one of the things being proposed here. There's going to be a new, the proposal includes a new community development test that is for both investments and for lending. And I think there's some real concerns that it's easier to lend than it is to invest. And therefore, if you can satisfy that test with lending as a bank, why invest in a tax credit like the housing credit? And there are some ways that I think we can create incentives, even if that investment test does go away. And then there's just also concerns that the retail test, which is the other big test other than the community development test, could have more weight to it than the community development test, and really wanting to make sure that the community development test is equally weighted. And I'm not going to go into further detail than that.
Yeah, we could, as I said, devote the whole webinar to that, and I'm afraid we are running out of time. I do want to remind folks to please feel free to enter in questions in the Q&A pane. I know we're going to try to get to questions. We still have a few more questions we want to ask our panelists, but please, feel free to enter in the questions, and I'm able to stay a little bit. We'll see how things are as we go forward. Very quickly, Jennifer, another issue that is really important to the CHAM audience, we don't have much time to discuss, but the average income test regulations, key regulatory development for the housing credit. What's the status of it? What are you expecting in the near future?
Average income test. We've had a proposed rule that's been out since October of 2020. I know that Treasury is working very hard on finalizing a new final rule that I am told will be very different from the proposed rule. We're very looking forward to seeing that and hoping that the final rule is much more workable. The proposed rule had a lot of significant problems that the industry as a whole really objected to, and the administration in its housing supply plan has said that it will come out by the end of September. And I'm wondering if Ellen's going to give us great news, because she's just took herself off mute.
I can't give too much news, but I can say that these regulations are amongst the highest priorities at Treasury. And my understanding is they'll be out this summer. I can't get into any specifics, but I can say that my colleagues in the Office of Tax Policy have listened very closely to the comments and are going to be responding accordingly in the regulations to provide the flexibility that were intended in the statutory changes in 2018. So stay tuned.
Great news. We'll all be looking forward to that. So Ethan, okay, we're in the lead stretch here, our final stretch. Let's talk about the new directions of time. One of the major initiatives is on climate change and resilience. HUD has a role to play in that. Could you discuss your priorities here?
Sure, and I'll be brief and encourage everyone to take a look at HUD's Climate Action Plan, which details a lot of the different pieces from across HUD. In the multifamily space, I talked already about our Green and Resilient Retrofits program that's part of the President's budget proposal. That would be a huge step forward. On the statutory requirement to periodically review the latest energy codes to understand how they support the affordability and production of energy efficient multifamily housing. We're in the midst of that process right now, but I'll tell you the early findings show that the adoption of the most recent energy standards, and it's been a while, would greatly improve the efficiency of new multifamily housing, which would reduce energy costs for owners and for residents for years to come. So it could be really positive. We're also focused on better supporting housing providers in their efforts to benchmark their energy consumption. So measure it and identify opportunities to improve, and also measure those improvements over time as we do them. That would be really powerful.
Great. Switching gears a little bit, could you provide an update on HUD's digital inclusion efforts? There's also some funding provided in the bipartisan infrastructure law, right?
There is. It is called the Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP, because why say whole words? That's offered through many internet service providers, and it gives households a $30 a month subsidy to cover the cost of internet service, and a one-time subsidy of $100 for computer devices for eligible households. It's it's a $14.2 billion program. It's made possible by the Infrastructure and Jobs Investment Act. Public housing residents and Section 8 residents are eligible for the ACP categorically. We are working with the FCC and the Universal Service Administrative Company to provide in hopefully more streamlined way to qualify people. So we can share, ideally, we will be able to share data with them so it can be easily demonstrated that, yes, this public housing resident or this Section 8 household is eligible for ACP.
Great. And then, of course, it wouldn't be CHAM not to bring up REAC and the inspection efforts, the new Inspire initiative, and other really important asset management issues. So can you provide an update here as well?
Sure. Top line is the REAC is open, the Real Estate Assessment Center. We are continuing to conduct inspections of insured and assisted properties across the country. REAC has completed over 14,000 inspections of multifamily properties since the resumption of normal operations last June. That's huge because for a period during the pandemic, we suspended regular inspections, but Secretary Fudge made a point to have us focus on a balance of the risks. There was a risk of bringing people into contact, residents, property managers, inspectors during the early part of the pandemic. We've learned, and relying on the best guidance we have available, we have great protocols for conducting inspections safely during the pandemic. We have built in some flexibilities that allow either postponement or cancellation of an inspection if necessary due to COVID. But we've seen a significant drop in these requests as folks have understood how to deal with it. We've also found in many cases that an inspection can be successfully completed by just changing which units are selected in the test, and we're able to do that. For instance, among the flexibilities we've built in, we have been giving a 28-day notice instead of a 14-day advance notice to properties, and that's been remarkably successful in giving just a little bit more time and notice in order to coordinate in this ever-shifting landscape. It's something we're watching closely and making sure that we adapt as needed. There's some resources available on our website. There's a flyer that outlines the rights and obligations of residents, owners, and agents when an inspection is scheduled. There are also Q&As posted for more specific situations. So I encourage folks to check those out. I know they've been made available as part of the webinar resources.
Great, thank you, Ethan. Another issue we wanted to raise is reporting HUD tenant rent payments as part of a way to improve their credit scores. Can you discuss the possibility of HUD adopting an opt-out approach facilitate such reporting?
Happy to discuss it. I know we are short on time and it's a really complicated issue. So I will say in brief that we are looking closely at rent reporting as a way to help residents build their credit, either establish new credit files if they don't have them already, or go from thin files to thick files, which are helpful in establishing better credit relationships. At the same time, we recognize that this is still an emerging area and there's good research going on. For instance, out in California, there has been a state level requirement for credit reporting, which provides an opportunity to study the results of it. As anyone who's looked at their own credit report knows, it's great if your credit report shows that you've been paying all your bills. If you've had trouble paying some of your bills, your credit report will also show that. And we don't want to do something that adversely affects tenants. And we know there's more research to be done. We also take the privacy of tenants very seriously, and we expect nothing less from our business partners than complete compliance with federal privacy laws. So tenant information, including family rent determinations, can only be used for specified program purposes. And so we're looking very closely at what our requirements are and how they would fit into those sorts of programs.
Okay, the last of my questions, so before we turn to Q&A from the audience, is on RAD. Could you give an overview of the status of RAD, Ethan? Talking about a little bit on the fair cloth of RAD I talked about earlier, or RAD for PRACT, and also just giving current projections. Do you think we're going to reach the public housing unit cap by the end of fiscal 2023? And what about the impact of the September 2024 program sunset? Anything to note there?
So lots of good questions on RAD, and I wish we had an hour to talk about it because RAD is critically important for the department's strategy to recapitalize and restore public housing properties, as well as the private properties that are captured under RAD component 2. No matter what funding level Congress dedicates to the Public Housing Capital Fund, we know that public housing authorities will need to leverage that fund with other resources. The needs of the portfolio are simply too great to think that federal appropriations on their own will be the only solution. And RAD is one of the key tools for leveraging other funds. There are other tools as well that work, but RAD's a big one, and we use it a lot. We've recapitalized over 160,000 homes under RAD. Public housing authorities have generated about $14.5 billion for construction improvements alone at former public housing properties. That averages over $70,000 per home in construction improvements. That's not all deal costs. It's just the construction improvements. So there's still plenty of room under the cap. The cap is 455,000 units. So there's plenty of room under that. In terms of the sunset date, that's been something that has been in many president's budget proposals, is in this president's budget proposal. And so I am confident that that will be addressed because Congress is always very diligent in addressing our budget proposals. There are a lot of exciting developments within RAD. I'll touch on them very briefly and do them a terrible disservice by not spending more time. Fair Cloth to RAD provides a mechanism for creating new public housing, not fixing old public housing, creating new units that are under the Fair Cloth limits, which are entertainingly named for a one-term senator who didn't like public housing. But we know that many public housing authorities have room under those limits. They're tied to 1990s levels of how much public housing there was. The key is having funding and having certainty about what the rent levels are. And Fair Cloth to RAD at least provides the certainty about rent levels so you can know going in what you would be developing and what rents it would command. RAD for Prax is another exciting piece of it that allows us to convert 202 and potentially, based on the budget proposal, 811 properties to full PBRA contracts, project-based rental assistance contracts, instead of the skinnier PRAC contracts that don't pay rent, they just pay operating expenses. So it provides some more leverage opportunities, some more capital opportunities to help sustain those properties over time. That's the super fast version.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you so much to all our panelists for racing through our packed agenda here. Greatly appreciate it. I know we have like 1 minute left for questions. There is one just submitted for you, I guess, Ethan. Is there any consideration given to provide an avenue for RAD PBRA owners to request special rent increases for insurance, utility, and other uncontrollable expense increases, given the substantial increases on these line items in the past couple of years? OCAF rates have not kept up with inflation.
So hi, Lucy. Good question. Thank you for asking it. So one reminder that the way OCAF works is in some sense, it doesn't keep up in real time. It is always lagged just because of how it works to look at past increases in expenses and increase rents accordingly. So we are expecting that there will be higher OCAFs as rising costs in a number of areas, insurance included, filter into them. One thing we are doing is looking carefully at the data sources that OCAF uses to make sure that it's accurately tracking things like insurance costs for multifamily properties. We have found an area to sharpen the pencil a bit there and hope it better reflects. We are also keenly aware of the challenges that owners are facing with rising costs. It's in a number of areas, and this is part of the overall focus on dealing with inflation in the economy. We are working to make sure in our budget proposal and our conversations with appropriators that the request for full renewal of Section 8 accommodates the needs of properties and that the full renewal is indeed a full renewal. We have on individual bases accommodated properties use of things like replacement reserves or residual receipts accounts to bridge short-term costs, recognizing that rent increases will catch up with it. And we are always looking for new solutions. So, any special rent increase typically needs authorization in order to do it. It's not necessarily something we can just do with administrative authority. But we are aware of the challenges and focused on making sure that properties can continue to serve residents in the way they need to.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. And with that, I do not see any submitted Q&A questions, and unfortunately, we've run out of time. Again, please join me in thanking Ethan, Ellen, and Jennifer for a great session. And I guess I'll throw it over to Julia to close us. You're on mute, Julia.
I'm going to be really short, just like the whole last 20 minutes has been. So I'll talk really fast, but if you stay to the very end, you'll find out where the next CHAM conference is going to be. So training, so just quick, what's happening with CHAM next? We are going to continue with our training for certifications. If you're interested, get in touch with me. We're going to have a training on housing development steps in late September. We are going to have a webinar on advancing your asset management career. That'll probably be in September. And are you ready? Our next conference, we're looking to be in next June in Charleston, South Carolina. We're starting to look for space. So stay tuned with all things CHAM and all things CHAM, not CHAMmed. And Ethan, Jennifer, Ellen, Peter, thank you very much. I learned a ton today, and I appreciate your frank and clear explanations of what's going on with the reconciliation bill. I just didn't really, I understand it now. Thank you.